Um, so, um, from looking in, looking out, whatever, how can producing nations retain greater value in country? And there's something I'd like to say as we start this, which is that we've really got interested in these questions maybe 3 years ago, sort of concurrent with some of the experiences we had with Cruzeiro in Brazil and also with Botswana. And God knows I have no answers, but I will say that I think this is one of the absolutely central issues of our time. And to allude back to something that Feriel said at the close of lunch, there is no one answer, and there is no person who has all knowledge. So it is definitely a process of both how you see, how you think, and what it is that people are seeking to achieve that works for them. So we have a wonderful panel. Brad Brooks-Rubin, from whom you heard this morning. Shara Gittleman, who is coming in virtually, who is with Newmont and is in charge of the, pardon? John, you're asking me a question? Oh, okay. Sorry about that, everybody. Anyway, I thought there was a question. Anyway, we are delighted to have Shari with us, and her particular domain or realm of concern is social performance and human rights. Estelle Levin-Nally from Levin Sources, and this is the first time that Estelle has been here, and I hope she's having a wonderful time because we definitely want her to come back. And shameless plug, Longo Mulasho Zinsner, and Longo has started an initiative called, the acronym is JGAA, and it is Jewelry and Gemstone Association of Africa. And she brings quite a unique perspective to things and is just back from her home country of Zambia to be with us. So I'm thrilled. Giorgio Di Tome, who is a professor of mining from Brazil, and Simon Watt, whom I'm absolutely thrilled is here. Simon is a co-owner, if you will, of a stone dealing concern, I hope that's the proper way of describing it, called Mayer and Watt, and I have always found him to be one of the most intensely smart people and have always hoped that we would find a way. So, I so hope that they will love their time here, and tomorrow you'll hear from his partner, who is also his wife, Lori Watt. So, with that, I give you this wonderful panel, and I am eager to learn from them. Sorry about that, everybody. Our moderator is Brecken Branstrator, and if you were there last night, yes, woo, you heard me. You heard me give a big shout out to Brecken, who in many ways changed my life. So we're thrilled to have Brecken here.
So lovely introduction, thank you. I'm really excited to be here with you guys today for this conversation. As Lisa alluded to, it's really been such a growing part of the conversation. As an editor who covers largely the colored stone world, it's certainly something we've been paying attention to in the past few years, and as we can tell from this wonderful panel, a just growing conversation in the industry overall. So we're here to hear some perspectives from sort of across the board about what it is, what it means to be retaining more value and how some of these examples are doing this. So I'm going to jump right into it since we've got a nice long panel ahead of us. And I'm going to start with Sherry, this lovely big face behind us. Sherry, talk us through, starting from sort of an LSM, larger mining conversation, what are some of the key ways that LSM contributes to creating value in country? And what are some of the challenges that you face when it comes to the local content in this conversation?
Yeah, I'd much rather be in the room. I guess this is my year to be the big head on the wall, the floating head. But I've been the last couple of years, and I can tell you, I can recognize some people from the backs of their heads in the audience, which is great. So I'm here with you, and thanks to Erin and Lisa and the team for letting me join virtually and not miss out. So I guess just to start, large-scale mining, I just want to start by saying we are contributors of taxes and royalties when we come and invest and start a mine. Last year, Newmont paid almost $2 billion, $1.9 billion in taxes and royalties at our operating mine sites in 9 countries. We publish a taxes and royalties contribution report every year. You'll find it on Newmont's website with a lot of detail on where those payments are made to. That's part of our commitment to transparency and accountability. We're signatories to the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. But that's not really what I want to focus on today, but just to say we do pay significant amounts to governments where we operate, but there are really 3 levers we have when we think about creating value in country. That first one is about local employment. So we also set public targets every year on hiring locally and also from indigenous communities around where we work. Newmont has around 20,000 employees globally. We have just about that same number in contract employees. And if you look at those employees, they're predominantly national hires, right? We don't staff our mines with Americans and expat positions. Those are local people from the country, and where we can, we hire from our local area of influence. The second lever we use for adding value in country is local procurement. So again, we set public targets on sourcing locally and from indigenous-owned community businesses, and we track our spend data and also publish it on national level suppliers, local or regional level suppliers, and then we have what we call local, which would be those community members that come from our direct area of influence. So just to give you an idea, last year we spent around $800 million procuring from our local suppliers. And a lot of those are businesses and livelihood opportunities that wouldn't exist without Newmont coming in and developing and creating those sourcing opportunities. So just to give you maybe an example on the ground, in Suriname, we work a lot with the community who are involved in informal artisanal mining, but we have a complementary economic development track for people who want to leave informal mining and start a new business. So it's a line of credit, it's training, capacity building, marketing skills. So we've got former ASM operators who are running a boat transport system on the river. We have a chicken farm, we have a company doing earthworks. Those are kind of the examples, and our goal is to create as much economic diversity as we can around our mine sites. Those are businesses that the mine can benefit from, but also the local community. And I'll talk a bit about the challenges with sustainability and local procurement. And then the third lever we have is social investment. So investing, partnering with our local communities and governments and partnering in community development projects. We invested $69 million last year at our mine sites, and that goes into health, education, cultural activities, economic development, working with local foundations and multi-stakeholder governance bodies to do that. But I want to call out a couple of the challenges we have when it comes to creating value in country, and about 2 of those levers, both on local procurement and local employment. For local employment, usually in most places where we operate in developing economies, there is a higher demand for jobs than Newmont or any one company can provide, right? There are finite jobs that we can offer. The second challenge is that we may not find all the skills that are needed at the mine in the local community. So we also have to spend a fair amount of time doing capacity building and creating that talent pool that will help serve the mine. And in order for us to hit those targets of hiring local and indigenous employees. So as an example, in Australia, we work with the Aboriginal community. We have a NALA Work Ready program. So that's one of our sponsored indigenous communities there. And it's an apprenticeship program. We've had 16 graduate classes go through the program at our Boddington mine. Those individuals have ended up with permanent jobs at the mine. Everything from site services to mine maintenance to logistics, right? But it really takes an investment of the company to make sure that local people who have been historically disadvantaged are able to benefit. In terms of local procurement, it's often a similar, situation. We may not have the businesses and goods available from the local community that the mine needs. So what do we do to identify those opportunities to build capacity, like I was talking about in Suriname, so that we make sure as much as possible local people are benefiting from that local procurement? So it takes hand-holding, takes time. It's much easier and quicker and sometimes cheaper to work with a large national supplier. So we have to put in place those capacity building programs to make sure we maximize that local procurement. The other thing is we have to be really careful about dependency. So what is the sustainability of those businesses and those jobs post-mine closure? How do we make sure if we have a women's co-op that's selling to the mine for the mess hall, that they're also tapped into other local markets and getting their produce other places, not just relying on the mine. So those are some of the challenges that we face, but I would say really important to our communities, our governments, where we operate in country. That local procurement employment are critical for how we build and maintain social acceptance where we operate. We have a big panel, so I'll leave it with that. Brecken, back to you.
Thank you so much, Sherry. And with that, I'm going to stay on the gold conversation, and I'm going to jump to Estelle. Estelle, I know you mentioned that you've been working on some gold processing plant projects, and if you want to talk a little bit about what that includes, that'd be great. And maybe just then also beyond that, tell us about the role and potential of gold processing plants as enablers of this value addition conversation.
Thank you. I really appreciate how Shari gave us the various dimensions through which value gets added, speaking about employment, taxes, procurement that a mine can do, and also the social investment. And I just want to comment on this to provide context. And I really liked also that Shari spoke about the importance of investing in human development and skills development and economic diversification, because really the primary way any enterprise, not just mines, but your businesses too, can add value for society is through building the capacity of people to be more knowledgeable, to be more skillful, and to transfer that knowledge and skills into other parts of their lives and other parts of the economy over time. And that's how we really drive sustainable development. But the other piece, and this is why I guess it makes sense, the second question, is looking into forward linkages downstream from the initial extractor of the material, and how do we keep a greater portion of the supply chain within a country. And there's been a number of efforts to do that with gemstones, very successfully in a very exciting fashion, particularly when they've been focused on the empowerment of women. But the work for the World Gold Council that Levin Sources did was at the very start of this year, where we worked with a range of local partners, including the Alliance for Responsible Mining and the Artisanal Gold Council, in 6 different countries where there's evidence of growth in their processing plant sectors, in order to really test the idea that investment in processing plants can support not just the formalization of ASM value chains, but also really stimulate sustainable development. And we found quite different approaches to how those sectors were regulated, governed, and economically enabled or disabled as a result of how the political economy was structured. So the countries were Peru, Ecuador, Mongolia, my jewelry's from Mongolia, Philippines, oh, John, you might have to help me, Mauritania, and Tanzania. And we found that, unfortunately, there were only really, although there were hundreds of processing plants that were in scope, there were only a couple that could really demonstrate the ability to be both commercially viable and responsible at the same time. In the majority of cases, if you were commercially viable, it wasn't commercially viable to also be responsible. And in other cases, if you were being responsible, you weren't going to survive. So really what we learned was that the conditions that make it possible for processing plants to act as aggregators, to act as retainers and stimulators of values in those countries rests on 3 things being in place. First is business models that, once again, the trust thing comes up, but business models that really nurture and bed in trust. Very importantly, between the artisanal and small-scale miners and the processing plants that are there to service them, because if those artisanal miners don't trust that they're getting a fair deal, they're not going to want to bring their gold to you, so you're not going to capture a greater portion into that more formalized or formalizing value chain. The second was quite understandably, the regulatory environment. In Mongolia, for example, a small-scale processing plant is expected to do an environmental impact assessment. That's not unreasonable. If you study the environmental and social impacts of gold value chains, you know that a lot of the environmental and social harms are conducted at the point of actual processing, particularly in relation to pollution, management of tailings, the use of water, and so on. But it was $75,000 to do an EIA, and they just didn't have the financial means to do that, nor did they have access to a loan or any other type of financial instrument to support them to do it. So they just couldn't do it. So they're in this perpetual state of semi-formalization and never able to be fully formalized. So, and that brings me to the third piece. So the government needs to get the regulations right. But the third piece is that kind of commercial infrastructure. We were just having a conversation about this outside, and it seems to be a conversation that comes up an awful lot in our work at 11 Sources on Value Chains, is that, it's that invisible piece of what makes it possible to trade, which is insurance, vaulting, warehousing, logistics, the stuff that I used to think was boring, and now I'm getting increasingly excited about. Maybe it's because I've moved back to Guernsey and that's what we do there. But actually, those commercial aspects can either make or break the potential for responsible production and value addition and value retention. So it ain't sexy, but it's important. Well, I think it's sexy.
And I'm going to go to Giorgio along the same lines, looking at the sort of government and producer level. What can you tell us about how producing countries can strengthen their local responsible sourcing mechanisms without relying on sort of this external top-down model? And I think this is where we have a graphic, if I could get our tech team in the back to make a quick swap.
Yeah, well, the World Bank, Mining Better Together document, I think some of you have seen it. I believe it was developed with Estelle, right? And it's fantastic because it has some concepts that are very relevant to what we are talking about here, right? The fact that sustainable progress should come or should be fostered from within the countries, right? The producing countries. So here's an example, right? It's like a solution, right? An approach that has been developed locally to carry out origin control and traceability of gemstones. Bracken introduced me as a university professor. Yes, I teach mining at the university, but in the beginning of my career, I worked as a mining engineer in an artisanal mining cooperative, and I was looking after an underground emerald mine. Okay, so I understand the problems, and in a way, it's intriguing that I've been visiting those sites recently. Let's say not many, but a few decades later, right? And they made progress with health and safety, but technology is still pretty much the same. So there are plenty of things we can do, right? So this type of solution is really to help these artisanal mining sites to get closer to the markets. This type of solution does not conflict with the international certifications that we've been talking about, right? But it goes along Brad's comment in the morning. It's about decision making. Okay, so this is an example. We are trying a local solution to connect the markets. Okay, the idea is to integrate the forgotten ones that we talked in the morning, which is the artisanal miners, with the rest of the supply chain, and have like a way to show that that gemstone that is here, being sold here, has a history and has been through all the proper steps and has a traceability condition. Okay, so that's the idea.
Okay, thank you. And so as we can see how many of the different parts of the supply chain are included in this conversation, I'm going to turn to Simon next, because in our pre-panel conversation, he offered Sri Lanka, where he sources from, as a very specific example for a source country that retains a lot of its value from its colored stone supply chain. So Simon, talk us a little bit about what goes into that and why you offer it as an example for being so successful.
Well, I can only speak in my own area, which is colored gemstones. And Brecken said I've been going to Sri Lanka for over 30 years. And what has impressed me about Sri Lanka is that they have been mining in the same fashion for centuries. And the systems they have in place there have been there for centuries. And a huge amount of value is retained by Sri Lanka, because when you get to colored gemstones, you have various levels, 5 or 6 levels of value added. You have the mining. That's your first value. Then you have the rough sorting or cutting. Then you have the wholesaling. Then you have the retailing. And finally, you have the consumer. At each level, you are adding value. I'm at the wholesale level, so I buy from cutters in Sri Lanka. I don't buy the rough, because the people in Sri Lanka know a lot more about the rough than I do, because they've been doing it for a very long time. The government also has intervened there. They don't allow foreign companies to own mines in Sri Lanka. All mining is owned by Sri Lankans. You can have an international partner, you can have an investor, but the ownership remains with Sri Lanka. I mean, about 40 years ago, a Dutch company brought in dredging equipment, because the Dutch are very good at dredging for obvious reasons. And they were dredging the rivers in Sri Lanka and pulling out massive amounts of corundum. Because I don't know if you know, but in Sri Lanka, all the deposits are alluvial. They're 35 to 50 feet below the surface. And also, there's a lot of them in the riverbeds. So if you can dredge the riverbeds, you can get a tremendous amount of sapphire. Well, they started dredging the riverbeds and pulling out huge quantities of sapphire, and the government looked at it and went, oh my God, this is an asset that the country has, this corundum, this sapphire, and all the other gemstones in the earth, is a value that belongs to the Sri Lankan people. It belongs to us. And we're allowing foreigners to come in and dig it out at vast quantities. So they stopped it. Now, if you want to dig in Sri Lanka, the ASM, the artisanal small miners, I mean, a classic example of the way it's done is you get 5 or 6 guys will get together and they'll go to a farmer and they'll say, I would like to dig in your paddy field. And the farmer will give permission. And they'll start digging, and then they'll get a generator, because that's the only machinery you'll see at any one of these mines. The generator is used there to pull the water out of the pit, which goes down 35, 50 feet. Now, generally what will happen is a third of the profits, or the third of the income that's generated from that pit, will go to the landowner. A third of the income generated from that pit will go to the 6 guys who are doing the digging. And maybe a third will go to the owner of the generator, or maybe they'll pay him a fee. But that's how it's done. That's how it's been done for centuries. I mean, obviously not before generators existed, but there are 60,000 people involved in artisanal small mining in Sri Lanka. And the government understands that that is a massive part of the economy. And it's an important part of the economy. And by keeping the artisanal mining done in the same fashion by hand, the asset is remaining in the ground a lot longer. And also, you're maintaining the value of the asset. The problem was, Ethiopian opal. I don't know how many of you people understand or know what Ethiopian opal is, but us in the colored stone business know that in 20, 30 years, we'll probably go back and say, my God, do you remember that Ethiopian opal that came out of the ground? Well, it came out of the ground in a country that had no infrastructure. They had no cutters. They had really no dealers. But they found this incredible material that came out of the ground. And the rough traveled out of Ethiopia, mainly to Bangkok, and it was bought for very little. So Ethiopian opal wholesales for $20 to $100 a carat today. And we're talking 10, 12 years down the road from when it was first discovered. An equivalent Australian opal will sell for $800 to $2,000 a carat. Now, when I say equivalent, Australian opal and Ethiopian opal have big differences. There are significant differences between the material, but the Ethiopian material should never have been sold and should never still be sold for $20 to $100 a carat. All that value has been lost by Ethiopia because there is no structure. My point being, Sri Lanka retains value within the country because those systems have been created over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years with government intervention. It is not something that you can, from the outside, go in and say, this is how you do it. It doesn't work that way. It's a little like democracy. We've all seen when the Western powers impose democracy on countries that have no history of democracy. It doesn't work. Of course it doesn't work. Democracy needs to be organic. It needs to happen organically. A bit like Uta's jewelry. I'm listening to her, and you can see her jewelry is 100% organic. There are no straight lines. It comes out of this creation. I'm probably diverging a little here, but what I'm trying to get at is that for value to be retained within a producing country in the colored stone business, and I can really only speak to the colored stone business, there needs to be a structure and a level. At each level of value added, there has to be those people within the country who are creating that. 30 years ago, there was a huge drop-off in sapphire production in Sri Lanka. It coincided with the discovery of Sri Lanka, of sapphire in Madagascar. So what did the Sri Lankans do? They sent guys to sit at the mines in Madagascar. That rough then traveled from Madagascar to Sri Lanka, and all those levels of added value remained in Sri Lanka. They didn't stay in Madagascar. Madagascar got the money from the rough, and that was it. Unfortunately, that's the way it still is in Madagascar, because there was never any local development. Thank you. I'm not quite sure. I don't have a solution. All I have is an example of a country that I go to that I see a system that works very, very well. Now, I have to admit, when I hear my friend Giorgio here talk about traceability, the guys in the sapphire rough markets at 4 o'clock in the morning handling little packets of stone with paper wrapped around them, hand to hand, would laugh. The last thing they want is for the guy they sell it to know who they bought it from. And unfortunately, that applies to the colored stone business pretty much right from the beginning. You know, I work with companies that ask me to give details of my traceability, and they say, well, who do you buy from? I don't answer that question. The value of my knowledge for 40 years in the business is knowing who to buy from. And because we deal in, you know, who knows about Paraíba? I'm sure people have heard of Paraíba. Probably the most valuable colored gemstone in the history of colored gemstones. The pocket, the original pocket of Paraíba tourmaline was probably a 20th of the size of this room. We're talking about materials that are so small and such small pockets all over the world, where you have groups of guys going out with picks and shovels digging in the ground. And it's been done the same way for centuries. Am I against this idea or this system? No, of course I'm not. But I'm a cynic and I'm a practical man.
Thank you so much, Simon. Just as an aside, Simon was one of the first people that I met when I joined the colored stone world, and as a journalist, as you can tell, he was an interviewer's dream. One question, he would give me my whole story, so I always appreciate the answer.
Thank you.
I do think lots of interesting points there, and I do think that's a good segue to turn to Longo. Before we do that, can we pull Sherry back up? Get our talking head. Sorry, Sherry, didn't mean to leave you out. Longo, tell us a little bit about your work with the Jewelry and Gemstone Association of Africa, particularly which producing countries you're working with, and as you work towards retaining greater value, what are the starting blocks for these projects?
Okay, so very briefly, our association is the first of its kind, in that it's the first association for Africa with a focus on jewelry training and gemstone education leading to economic sustainability. As a new association, we don't do this alone. We've got the blessings of Dr. Gaetano Cavalieri, who's been instrumental in asking us the right questions. So I always take a juncture to say thanks to him for that. We also work with the Africa Center for Economic Transformation, ACET. They're a policy and research think tank based in Accra, Ghana. So to answer your question on preserving value addition in country, in working with ACET, I'll give you the ACET response and then medley that with what we're doing as an association. So ACET aim to achieve economic transformation within a decade. Economic transformation is separate from economic growth, and they believe that the solution for doing that is creating what they call depth. Depth starts with the diversification of economies. So for example, I'm from Zambia, and through my research, I can confirm that the jewelry industry in Zambia is not as evolved as that in Ghana or South Africa or Botswana. However, with the depth formula, if you had the diversity in economy, you're able to engage more people in the value chain. So you could have a costume jewelry industry, fine jewelers, specialists, stone setters, and that in itself contributes to the economy. You've also got export competitiveness as a result of what you're producing, as a result of your diversified economy. All of this still means that your product is still being kept in country because you've got more players, like Simon said, rather than the rough being shipped out immediately. You've got more people on the ground being involved in the value production. Second to D and E, diversity and economic export competition is productivity, which is also a byproduct of the other two letters in the acronym. You then have training and technology. So technology is key to economic growth on the continent. Obviously, it streamlines processes. You're not going through the same motions over and over again. However, in Africa, whilst this model's developed exclusively for Africa, we have the challenges of things that we take for granted in this room, like electricity, and what we now term load shedding, where electricity is on and off basis. H in the depth stands for health and well-being, which is key and central. So in order, from ACET's point of view, to really have economic transformation, you need depth. So for Africa's position, it's not that straightforward because it's a bit like Maslow's syndrome, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We're often not even on the first rank. But to speak away from an economic model and more on the day-to-day of what we do as an association, through my work, I've seen that value retention is happening in the continent. And the producing countries we work with, which is Zambia, Zimbabwe, Ghana, Nigeria, and of late we've expanded through collaboration with other countries to other African countries. A lot of preservation is taking place, it's just not known about. I've made a pointed effort, for example, today, to wear the work of different African jewelers to put that face forward for Africans. So I don't want to go on forever, but in short, a lot is happening in the continent. It's just a matter of how we capture that and start to see it in forums like this and other spaces. So I'd like to point out that I'm wearing jewelry made in Nigeria and designed by a Nigerian jeweler. Her name is Olujukome Oluwatumbi, and a brooch by Kumo Makwa from Botswana. She's part of the De Beers Shining Lights Awards. So in summary, again, I could go on because I'm very passionate about this, but what I would like to say is there is a lot of value added in country. It's just about mapping that and getting a better understanding of the different players. And like Ferial said, meeting them where they are, rather than where we as a global industry should think they should be. So.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to Brad next. I think anybody who's been to this conference before maybe has heard, I certainly heard it last year, that Brad mentioned this idea of calling out the bad actors that aren't providing ample transparency, doing their due diligence, sort of as a method of exposing that. And part of that came up with this conversation too, as we were sort of talking about this panel, which I thought was really interesting. So Brad, talk us a little bit through about that, how that conversation plays into this idea of retaining value and those that might be inhibiting countries from doing that.
Sure, thank you. Mainly it came up because I didn't have any idea how I got on this panel, actually, especially listening to other counterparts. I'm not an expert in development and doing things on the ground in this way, and so I've learned a lot from this. I understand more about being in government and civil society downstream, and frankly in the role that we all play on a daily basis in considering whether or not what role we play in value being lost. So I'm going to just mention three things up top. I think a lot of this all comes from both from producing countries, but also from downstream on the concept of expectations, honesty. I teach a class at Georgetown called Resource Curse Responses, and a lot of it has to do with the idea of countries discovering a natural resource and expecting a lot of things to come through and not fully understanding the industry, not necessarily getting accurate information from those in the industry. Obviously, I think companies like Sherry's are exceptions, but it's not always the case. These industries are hard. I mean, I'm a frequent critic of the Kimberley process, but the Kimberley process statistics are a model of what a lot of initiatives should be doing, and just looking at a couple of years alone tells you that there's a lot of nuance to this sector. In 2018, for example, $15 billion of mined diamonds turned into $48 billion of exports because of trade back and forth. In 2022, it was basically the same value, $15 billion of mined diamonds, $47 billion roughly of exports. In 2018, it took 150 million carats to get you to that 15 billion. In 2022, it was 120, right? So 30 million carats less got you basically the same values. And in 2024, 107 million carats, only $9 billion of exports, and 30 billion, or 9 billion of mined production, 30 billion of exports. So and every diamond industry person here is more of an expert than me to explain to a producing country the nuance of why those statistics are the way they are. But a lot of decisions are made by governments and by downstream actors based on data that they don't understand. And the more we don't have transparency and trust in information and data so that, again, decisions can be made by producing countries that decide, hey, we need an export ban because all this value is being lost. No, you need to understand the sector better to know where your value is. I always use this quote from a rapper named Chance the Rapper. Sometimes the truth don't rhyme. It's the greatest rap quote ever. Sometimes the truth don't rhyme. It's okay, but we have to be able to be honest about it. So that's one. More data, more information that allows people to make real decisions. Two, and this is maybe the most important part for the downstream industry, is due diligence and transparency. If you are not conducting appropriate due diligence, in addition to other things, you are likely contributing to the lost value of production, period. You are likely doing business, or at least at a minimum, you don't know if you are not doing business with someone who has been involved in taking money out of a producing country, whether that's manipulating value in a trading center, or at a refining center, or at a smelter, or at a manufacturer. Along the way, lots of people are manipulating, and if you are not doing appropriate levels of due diligence and meaningful traceability, and whether or not Simon traceability is possible at 4 a.m. in Sri Lanka or in Bangkok, it is possible for downstream actors to ask those questions and understand what at least the overarching system is, to know whether or not they're doing business with people who may be doing many things, but among them taking value out of a country without paying taxes, royalties, and what they should be doing. So due diligence, if nothing else, is important to ensure that associations like Longo's can exist. Because if you're not doing due diligence, you're part of the problem. And then third is sanctions and regulations. And as someone who has been a part of helping sanctions get imposed and hearing all the time about how this hurts the producing countries, and this hurts the industry. I have many ways to defend sanctions, but among them are, unless we are willing as governments to impose accountability and enforce against actors who are documented to have been doing a number of illicit activities, among them usually engaging in corruption, not paying taxes, not paying royalties, unless there's enforcement, unless there's accountability for those actors, and unless you are doing due diligence against it, again, we're enabling this system. So it's not that sanctions should be imposed on people in producing countries, to the opposite. Actually, we need a lot more sanctions activity in trading centers, in refining centers, in manufacturing centers, in retail, among retailers, in other places in the world who are a part of that ecosystem. And I think those tools, again, they're in some ways a very much less sexy and much less interesting part than understanding how development programs work. But unless there's meaningful enforcement, unless there's meaningful accountability, it becomes too easy for people to look out the back door. And I think we need to think about those kinds of tools as contributing to development rather than simply adding costs.
Thank you, Brad. So just a few more questions for my panelists, and I promise I'll leave time for you guys. But just a few more things, and I invite the whole panel to talk about this, but I want to direct this first one back to Giorgio. After we've had these conversations about creating these systems from within the country, what then can these producing countries do to make sure that these local traceability programs are recognized internationally and sort of aligned with international buyers?
Yeah, well, like we heard from Simon, right, the view of the international buyers. They have their own criteria, expectations, and requirements. And he was very candid and pragmatic in the approach. But I think we want to improve, right? And again, making a reference to the MBT, the mining better together. There are some principles that we want to seek, right? Which is initiatives that bring credibility to the market, that are technically appropriate. I think it's right, okay, Estelle, let me know. But what I read, systems that are transparent and inclusive. We want those type of changes, right? So when we present that practical approach that we developed in Brazil, it aims to make the connections between the producers, like the original producers and the market, and the rest of the market, and ending up with the international buyers. These people, I think Christina knows, these people have expectations of being part of the game. They want to be part of the game, right? So by introducing this, we could make some progress. I'm not saying that we'll replace all the current market with this type of approach, but at least a little bit could benefit from it, okay? I was thinking, Simon, I don't know if you guys saw Simon's app. He has an application on the mobile, which it's very interesting, right? And I would love to see some of those stones with a little QR code that would bring the history of that particular stone. Not all of them, maybe not the majority, but a few of them. And we could experiment if that makes a difference. I would love to see that, okay? So here, Lisa has been emphasizing for some time ethical sourcing in this conference, right? We need to work on ethical sourcing. And it's not only about avoiding harm, right? Avoiding problems. It's also promoting local communities and trying to find ways to make improvement for these people, okay? So that's the idea, Bracken.
Anything to add from any of our panelists?
I would just like to say, if somebody wants to pay for somebody to do the work on the QR coding, I'd love to do that on my app. Reality is anybody can call me or Laurie or Jeffrey, my son, and ask. We know where every single stone comes from. Mm-hmm. I can't tell you every single stone we sell. No. I am a cynic. I know. I've been doing this an awfully long time. We deal with a very large online company. 15 years ago, they sent me a letter and said, we need you to sign this, otherwise we can't do business with you any longer. And the letter basically said that every stone that I supply to them, I can guarantee there was no child labor involved, there was no this, there was no that, there was no other whatever, blah, blah, blah. In other words, every stone I sold them was beautifully clean and green. And I called up the owner of the company and said, I can't sign this. And he said, why? Everyone else has signed it. Mm-hmm. I said, because I can't. And he said, well, we'd like to continue doing business with you. And I said, I'd love to continue doing business with you. He said, well, I can change the document. He said, how? If I change it to, we do our absolute very best to ensure that every stone we sell you. And he said, that's good enough for me. And that's the reality. And we talk about bad actors. I 100% agree. I mean, again, I go back to Sri Lanka, where they've been doing this for centuries. And I know when I talk to my agent, and my agent takes me to Ratnapura, and I sit in an office in Ratnapura, and he arranges for people to come and see me. And I buy from these people. There are no bad actors in that line that stretches around the corner and around the block that are waiting to see me, because if there are bad actors in that line, my agent, Furkan, will never ask them to come and see me again. And I understand that we can improve matters. I try and improve matters all the time. Laurie and I are very, very committed to doing business with people. The people we do business with, there's probably nothing in paper that says they're good people, but believe me, we make sure we're dealing with good people, because that's what's important, and we make sure that the people they're dealing with are good people. That's part of the system that, as far as I'm concerned, I've never called myself an ethical gem dealer, but I called myself a gem dealer, and I try and do business ethically because that's how I sleep at night. And I'm not sure I need certification to prove that. And my problem is, yes, we've got technology that can do so much these days, and yes, we can do that. It's my issue with lab reports, too. I wrote an article 25 years ago saying, are we selling paper or are we selling gemstones? We're selling something that is so incredible, created billions of years ago under the earth, that blows my mind every time I look at it. Every day when I wake up, I never know what I'm going to see next. Now, I'm in a market where I have 100 different products in my backpack when I go out to sell. It is very different from the gold business, the diamond business, the silver business. You're talking about one product. It's easy to sell diamonds. There's only one product. I'm selling 100 different projects when I walk in my customer's door. And because of that, it's impossible to ask for this system of proof and traceability. Do I think it's a good thing? Yes, but I do that every day. And so do all the people I know who deal ethically and have been dealing ethically for years and years and years. Do I need a stamp on my back to say that I am ethical? No. When the RJC came out, I went, oh boy, I'd love to join the RJC. So they sent me the paperwork. My company doesn't hope in hell of joining the RJC. We can't join the RJC. We don't have the manpower, we don't have the funds, we don't have anything else to say that we are ethical. However, anybody that deals with Laurie and Simon know we're ethical. That's all I got.
Sister. Can I add something, which is that, having worked in gold and gemstones and other materials for responsible sourcing over the years, one of the things that I learned very early on was the importance of trust, how gemstones were a trust-based ecosystem, and a person's reputation was everything. And you relied upon the individual's reputation and the fear of damage to the reputation as the form of assurance.
Yes.
Around things. Whereas in gold, because it is basically finance, is basically money. You have FATF and other regulations that must be applied, which means that gold refiners and anybody trading gold cannot do something on the basis of an individual's reputation or just on the basis of trust. They have to, for regulatory reasons, demonstrate through third-party systems that something is conformant with a standard. And I would love to be in a world where we could just trust that somebody does the right thing. But, I live in an island where, somebody is a paedophile, but I don't know it, and I walk past them in the street, it's like a lovely person. Sorry to use that very egregious example, but The point is, there's a lot of stuff that can go on behind closed doors that you just don't know, and this is why we need, this is why a portion of the industry is looking for extra guarantees. And I think the point that people were making on traceability earlier is that whilst traceability can be seen as a cost and a burden, and even an offence in a trust-based industry where where you see, well, why should I be subject to such scrutiny? Why should I have to participate? I completely understand that reaction, but actually, it can unlock value. And it can unlock value in a range of ways. It is absolutely crucial to making product passports possible. It is absolutely crucial to be able to make defensible claims around an individual product or product category's unique qualities that might allow a cynical buyer to say, I can trust this, or I particularly want a gemstone from this provenance because it has a meaning to me, or I particularly want a gemstone that I know supports women's economic empowerment because I'm a feminist. So traceability can unlock value for those that choose to need it. And I think that it's really beneficial that we have that, and we have that option. It may be that we hit a day that everybody has to be traceable. It may be that we don't. But I think the fact that it can unlock value is indisputable, and there's definitely room for it in our sector.
Okay.
I'm sorry about the paedophile reference. That was completely inappropriate, and I really regret that.
Certainly a lively conversation, one I'm sure we could carry on for a while. I'm going to just throw one more question out because Estelle had this pre-panel, and I think it could just take the conversation a little bit beyond where we are now, and then I promise questions. Estelle, you wanted to answer the question, is value addition enough?
Yeah. No. Value addition for whom?
Yeah.
I see this a lot in the critical minerals world, market nations vying to be the ones that invest and the ones that access the material in order to defend their own economies and defense and technology industries, and I totally get that. But I'm the chair or the co-chair of the working group on meaningful stakeholder engagement and equitable beneficiation. I know. On Make It Fair for the Global Investor Commission for Mining. And the reason this came up, there's 6 major issues that the Global Investor Commission for Mining is looking at in order to set expectations for investors around, so that investors can set for mining companies on how to deliver on sustainability as miners. It became very apparent across the 47 commissioners that the concept of fairness and how benefits and harms are distributed really matters. And as somebody that is, also an advocate for women, it's clear that women, bear a disproportionate portion of, and children, of the harms that are generated by mining. And there's a lot of evidence for that. And so, value addition is really important, and we want to be maximizing that, and there's been really interesting variety of pathways through which that can be achieved. I think that's been shared on the panel. But I do think we need to think about, well, how do you do that fairly? And there's kind of a spectrum. The very first is to make sure that you are engaging your stakeholders and you really understand how your business is affecting them. By stakeholders, I mean primarily rights holders, but also stakeholders. How they affect them positively and adverse and negatively. And is there something you need to do to make that fairer and more equitable in terms of how things are shared? So a lot of companies struggle to engage their stakeholders meaningfully, and there is guidance on what meaningful means. The OECD has guidance on meaningful stakeholder engagement, for example. I know that it's something that Shari eats, lives, and breathes at Newmont, because they do a lot of stakeholder engagement aligned with international standards. The next, along from just listening, is actual participation in decision making. And that can be done through community forums, community development agreements, and so on, but also just meaningful participation in governance of not just an initiative, but the company itself. And so we're seeing a range of companies where, for example, indigenous peoples have an actual, if not a role in equity, but they at least have a role in governance. Moving along is equity participation. Can local communities actually be shareholders? And I remember in Zambia at a proper business forum, the Zambian president was speaking very clearly about how important it was from a value addition point of view to ensure that Zambian businesses weren't just involved in the exploration and feasibility definition piece of the mining life cycle, but those investors got to remain involved as things moved from development into operation, so they could really be taking on less of the risk and getting more of the reward in how they were participating. So participation, in either in equity or in the financial part is the next. And then you go even further along, and the other model is social enterprise. So some of you here will be aware of the Peace Gold initiative that Greg Valerio is pioneering in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Super exciting initiative that we're very proud to be a partner in. And they're a social enterprise, and their uniqueness is that the mining cooperatives co-own the exporting entity in DRC, giving them a business case to operate legally and export legally as well. And then the ultimate that I think we need to be talking about is materials as a service, which is only possible with traceability. And this is something that is being tried in textiles. It's being tried in some parts of metals value chain, so downstream jet engines. And what this is imagine the concept where we don't have an extractivist system of minerals development. We have a system where that community, where those gemstones were found in Sri Lanka, retain ownership of that gemstone as it moves through all the value chain onto my finger. And then when it goes into its next life, they get a royalty for its recrafting into the next phase of its development. And so you allow perpetual value to be assigned to that mining community even after the mine has closed. It's very radical, but it's very exciting. We're quite far away from making it real, but it's not impossible. So yeah, I just wanted to make that point. We need to be fair in how we add value to.
Okay, on that note, your turn. So I saw one over here. Sorry, behind you, Lori. Sorry, she was already raising hand. Sorry. And then I'll go to Christina. I'm sorry. I love you.
Thank you. I just wanted to I think that one day we have to have some sort of discussion on what's traceability. Being from a traceability company, traceability is not about saying who your commercial relationships are and the naming. The third-party traceability is, the whole point is the proof without content. So it means that we know the value chain, and the value chain is there, it's locked up on blockchains usually used for that, but not that anybody can use that to bypass any commercial relationships. It's just in case of an audit or a customs wanting to go through the value chain, they would have the possibility to open the books, but the books are closed for the rest. And you always choose what you, at least in our system, what you're going to transfer to the next step of the value chain. So the whole point of third-party digital traceability is to preserve the commercial relationships, but by being able to give that due diligence. And I would like also to add that with Sri Lanka, and I would really happy to talk about it, with working with the Sri Lankan government and the universities and the Hamburg universities on the value chain of these sapphires, especially to be able to tell a story. And a third point is diamonds became a commodity because nobody was telling the individual story of each diamond, which was still possible in gemstones. And this is what the diamond sector is suffering from. It became a commodity. It's not a gem anymore somehow. I mean, I'm being rough saying that. And a last point, yes, there's no solution that is 100%. But if everybody was doing business like you are doing, Simon, then maybe it wouldn't be necessary, but not everybody is doing that. Yes. That's why these systems, unfortunately, that also pollute, just to underline that, are being put in place and become necessary. And then people who do business like you do, who wouldn't necessarily need all these standards, and standards are another discussion, because traceability is not about standards. We can trace gems with the child labor. We just take a picture of what's happening. It doesn't judge, it doesn't control, it doesn't go into the system. But the certification is totally another discussion. You need to reach certain criteria. It's much more hard. I don't know if it's really fair or not. That's another point. But the long story short, I wanted to say is that we would love everybody to do business and know who they do the business with, but not everybody does that. And that's the unfortunate situation. Why these sort of systems get imposed. So that's a long story short.
Well, does anyone want to?
What is your system that you were talking about? I'm sorry? But is that blockchain? I guess my issue with blockchain is monitored and audited and controlled by human beings. Each chain, each part of the chain, a human being has to make that.
It's for the people online. But the traceability, what's logged onto the systems, there's where we need also humans to check on that. And for example, we partner up with SCS
Well,
for some
I guess
points.
what I'm saying is, why does blockchain have any more value than
Because
my supplier telling me and I write it down?
Because
I
your
mean-
documents can be changed, blockchain, we know who did what and when, and you can't go modify it. Like we were talking this
Well,
morning
you
about
can't
voting.
modify it, but you can't guarantee that the original information that was put in or the original data that was put in was correct.
No, but you have the KYC about who did what and when.
But to me, that means
Yeah,
it's
and there is a lot-
meaningless.
no, but
It's
it's
just
true.
paper.
And for example, but it's not only
It's
paper.
digital.
It's
It's digital proof that isn't necessarily correct because there's no proof. It's still human beings
Yeah,
doing
but-
the digital inputting at each way along the blockchain.
Yes.
That's why I don't understand why people put such faith in blockchain, because human beings are the ones entering the data.
And there's a mixture between, now you added with the connectors, like we are having Serene this morning, and you have other scans, and you have the DNA, and you have a lot of technologies being put in place. And with Hamburg University, it's about putting AI. I know it's more technology, and it's hell for me as I'm being in that, but is to add AI to know where are the fragile points to reduce the risk. And as I said, it would be lovely if everybody would do business as you do.
But have you ever dealt in rough stones and cut stones? And do you
I don't deal
understand
with
how
rough
you...
stones.
No, there
But
is
that's
no
why we
way
need
you can
people like-
identify a stone that's come out of the ground and then goes to a cutter and is cut and then goes to...
Can
There's
I
no way
call
you can...
a timeout on this? Would love to get into more questions. Is that all right? Can we continue this offline? I'll just keep passing it on so we can get in just a few more. Lori and then
Some of
Christina.
my issues are, you point to the stone in your ring, right? So who made the ring?
Correct jewelry using
And-
pre-certified silver from Ouro Verde and topaz that I bought when I was in Brazil in
So
2005.
you're fortunate enough to be on that level, right?
Yeah.
But when I go on the road, and I carry a bag for 45 years, and I walk into a jewelry store in Des Moines, Iowa, and I'm dealing with one jeweler who sits at a bench and makes his jewelry, and his art is as valid as someone from in-country, from someone around the world. I don't care where they're from. They don't have that accessibility to chain that stone, right? And all of a sudden, you're usurping the whole system that we've established over hundreds of years of moving gems around the world to make jewelry. And I look at what Longo, I don't want to mispronounce it, is presenting. She's working on a government level with NGOs to put together a system that then can present to the world. I don't want, excuse me, an ITC, someone chaining my stones and then telling me where I can buy them, who I can buy them from, and what's right or wrong. I think it's a closed market and it's self-serving. And it's
Yeah.
really sad.
Yeah, I don't think that traceability solutions tell you who you can and cannot buy it from. What they do is they provide you access to the information in a way that is trustworthy so you can make that choice. And I don't think I'm advocating for the universalization of traceability across all aspects. What I'm saying is there is a role for it to deliver to those markets that either will require it for regulatory reasons or where it offers an additional piece of information to a consumer or to a business which brings value to them and they're looking for that. Sure.
And beauty.
I mean, that goes back to the discussion this morning of like traceability and transparency for whom? And you're applying your analysis of your experience to what works for you in your industry. We have these conferences because the industry isn't working for everyone across the supply chain. Like, it's just not. And the value whether it's a conversation about human rights issues, which we'll have tomorrow, or environmental issues, or value retention, the fact is, like, there are a lot of people doing a lot of good business and making things very ethically or responsibly or sustainably, as the next discussion we'll get into. But the fact is, it doesn't work for everyone. And so the idea that we need solutions and evolution and information in order to allow people to make their decisions, I don't think that's fundamentally trying to break the system. It's trying to recognize that the system is at least partially broken as it is, even if lots of beautiful things are being made and lots of great business is being done.
Okay, Christina.
Yeah, so I have a question for Giorgio and for Longo. But first, I just wanted to say, I guess just to Brad's point, the certain parts of the industry are modernizing and responding to consumer choices, and also I think choices in people in this room. And I think it's okay to have amazing stock, but also respond to new requests. And so you can continue to have these amazing stock, and then also source differently, responding to new trends, right? So you can have los dos, as we say in Spanish. I was wondering for Giorgio, if you could tell me more about your new system. Have you tested it out in Brazil, and what does that look like? Does it work for minors? And I guess who's administering it? And what are the things that you're learning? And then for Longo, you and I have chatted about your work in Zambia. I was wondering if you could tell us about it, especially about the women that you're working with copper, and the mine that you're working with. I thought that's a really interesting story that I think would be really inspiring for people in the room.
Yeah, thanks, Christina. Well, it's an initiative associated with the Institute of Gemstones in Brazil. So it's something that they asked for a way to approach this challenge that very similar to what Brad said. There are some people putting effort to try and change things. What can we do to help that, okay? So it was the Institute and has been built with the help of some specialists, especially, from my side, the origin, and from the transformation side as well. A colleague that was here last year, Adriana Moll, helped us with that. So what we how come we came up with that? It was really some of the producers very eager to be part of the game. And after we started the conversation with them, the government came and said, "Oh, what can we do to help?" We said money. Oh, well, that's difficult, right? But at least we are having the conversation. So it was is like a non-governmental, but there is involvement from the government as well right now, okay? That's it.
Okay. Very briefly, I work with a school in Zambia. It's a CSR initiative of one of the world's largest copper mines, Kansanshi mine, in collaboration with First Quantum Minerals, a Canadian and Australian copper mine. So they've got a project in the northwest of Zambia. It was started just by chance by an expatriate's wife. They moved from South Africa and she had nothing to do because she couldn't work as one of her conditions. So she asked the mine if she could start a school for vulnerable women in the community. So she got together with the YWCA and they found these vulnerable women. I'm sorry to not have the slides on, but then they'll be available either today or tomorrow. And the story of these women is very, for me, it's very personal and very touching because I went to visit them in February. So they work with what we term within the association, the rainbow beneath our feet. They're a great example of value addition at source because they work directly with the copper from the mine. It also tells many stories of sustainability because those are the copper scraps that the mine can't use for industrial purposes. So nothing goes to waste. So these women, unfortunately, are victims of domestic abuse. They're on average between 18 and 25 years old. Many are committed to a career in jewelry, but that's another thing in the sense that once they've done this 2-year program with the mine, what next? Often they have to go back to careers in the mine, well-paid careers, but then they've set their sights on jewelry, but there's no continuation in terms of jewelry careers, especially in Solwezi and in Zambia. So it's an initiative that I'm happy to discuss at length. It's still ongoing. I went there with a tutor from the UK, Calvin Burke. He's a German-trained tutor and co-owner of K2 Academy in London, a contemporary jewelry school. And one thing I did notice on his trip when we arrived, they were thinking very small. And by the end of the week, they were speaking about their work confidently. They were working to larger scale. They weren't relying on Pinterest or Instagram for inspiration. Because one thing we did tell them is to go outside. I mean, I don't want to sound like a cliche or biased, but to me, being in Africa is inspirational. So we had a day where the rain was glistening like diamonds, and they walked around and they came back with these ideas, which they then displayed. We took their displays to the Gem Genève exhibition, and we're proud to be going there again next year to keep exhibiting and putting schools like in Sanchi and other schools we can find where they should be rightly. So that's it in a nutshell. So thank you, Christina.
Do we have time for more questions? Lisa, do we have time for more? Okay. Are there any more questions? Yeah.
Alan Martin from London Bullion Market Association. I've had the privilege of working both doing investigative research on illicit supply chains of diamonds and gold, and now obviously I'm working as a precious metal regulator or authority, and so I've seen both sides of this issue, and I take your point about I think this rush to blockchain being a bit of garbage in, garbage out. I get that, but I'm also reminded of people like John Ruggie, who talked about this idea of, for those who don't know, John Ruggie was involved in the UN Business and Human Rights framework, and he talked about this idea that you cannot be for something unless you can demonstrate how you're for something, and I think there's a balance that has to be found somewhere between those two. I guess for the panel, I'm wondering whether, if you think about a lot of the due diligence, a lot of the burden of that is placed on, in many cases, at the very bottom of the food chain. You're asking, artisanal miners in very rural areas without understanding of the OECD due diligence framework to conform to things that they have no idea about, and also asking them to pay for things that they have no money for. So I'm wondering whether there's also a need for a bit of a rethink about where do you put the due diligence burden, and whether you have any ideas about where that burden should be perhaps placed.
You go first.
It was sort of what I was trying to say at the beginning. Is I think it is, it's unfair in many cases that the information that is requested in the due diligence process gets sort of passed down and sort of buck shifted far enough down the chain, and then the sort of blame left further upstream. I think that's inappropriate. Again, that's why I think enforcement and accountability is necessary on LBMA refiners, on diamond manufacturers in places like Dubai, in India, in Belgium. That level of accountability is necessary because in order for due diligence to be taken seriously, and in order for things not to just have been shifted to auditors, right? In some ways, it's not even just that companies are shifting, it's sort of the burden is shifted to auditors who often don't have the information they need to ask the right questions of the companies to know, well, where are the problems, right? If a lot of due diligence is spent asking about the wrong issues, then we're wasting our time, right? There could be artisanal miners in plenty of places where it isn't that things are rainbows and unicorns, but may not be getting at the kinds of issues that we are seeing, say, from industrial or semi-industrial production of gold in Sudan. And the number of refiners, I wonder, who are asked, or downstream companies, I wonder how many jewelry companies have asked the refineries or the suppliers you're buying from, is any of this gold from, is Sudan in my supply chain? It is the scene of the worst humanitarian crisis on the planet. There's a genocide going on there, an uncontroversial or uncontroversially named genocide. And I wonder how many jewelry companies and companies in the gold supply chain are asking their suppliers. It produces 100 tons of gold a year. It's not like it's not small amounts. That's not. I mean, the Sudanese have lots of problems. That's not the fault of a Sudanese artisanal gold miner. That's the fault of the downstream industry. So that's where the burden lay. And I think certification systems that aren't kicking out their members or aren't decertifying auditors who aren't asking those questions, that's where the problem is to me.
Reckon, can I chime in on
Yes,
top of
please.
Brad? Sorry.
Yeah.
I don't know how to raise my hand here. I think just, I spent 7 years working in the apparel industry in between my stint in mining, and did a lot of work on traceability with cotton. And we really saw progress being made. It wasn't coming from cotton farmers. They're not the ones saying, hey, we need to be able to sell cotton. It doesn't work that way. It's when brands started saying we need to tell our customers where cotton's coming from, where materials are coming from, where things are made. When customers start asking, it hits your bottom line, and that drives the business case for it, as well as regulation, right? If you think you can't import something into the United States because it's got linked to forced labor, there are other due diligences. So this is the reason Simon gets the letter, right? Simon gets the letter because somebody's got customers and has commitments that they're making, and they're trying to do their due diligence. And I think, to Estelle's point, like, we don't know what we don't know. You do have to ask questions. And I think, Simon, it's not that you're not doing due diligence. Nobody can say, oh, we know 100% nothing's going wrong, but what are all the things we put in place to try and make sure we're identifying any of those negative impacts and mitigating them? But I think it's coming regardless, because I think as long as consumers care, regulatory, regulations are going to be introduced, and that starts to make all of this happen, whether we like it or not. And it's still, there are human beings involved, and it's not going to be perfect, but we just can't afford to not know with the problems that this group has raised. So,
Thank you. I think. Can you keep it quick? So we can,
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I know it's not easy for me. So the problem. Your question, Alan, is a really important one, because you're talking about how equitable is the act of due diligence. The act of due diligence is supposed to discharge a company's responsibility to respect human rights in conformance to the United Nations Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights, John Ruggies framework, out of which the OECD guidance cascades as part of the OECD guidelines, right? And the point of due diligence is not, it really isn't about demonstrating compliance. The point of due diligence is to drive social change. It's to support the fulfillment of human rights. And the problem is, when we take a compliance-led approach to it, we take a defensive posture to it, we see it as a cost center, and we therefore don't approach it from the position of how can it actually improve our business, build greater resilience into our supply chains, prevent us from being connected to human rights abuses that could harm our reputation, or that could make us unable to sleep at night. And so, there's a lot of positive value to be gotten out of the act of due diligence when it's done well, from an assertive posture of seeking to use it as a way for reducing the likelihood of an incident arising and reducing the severity of the adverse impact should it arise. And so, I think the question of the distribution of the cost of it is very merited, and it's important, and there are initiatives like Data Stake and others that say actually the information that the downstream is seeking to gather as a condition of deciding if and how to do business with the upstream, actually that information is valuable, and the artisanal miner should own that information, and they should get value from that information. And so there are ways, this is only a discussion, and people are trying to figure out how do we unlock value from it. I think one of the most innovative and exciting ways I see due diligence data being used to unlock value is through the processing plant Mwamba in Tanzania. Also going for B Corp certification, which would be utterly groundbreaking and exciting for our sector if they achieve that. But they have a solution where they are they're increasingly working with artisanal small-scale miners as their suppliers. And on the back of the business that they are doing and the due diligence they're doing on this ASM, they are building a profile of information about each miner that is the basis for developing trust. So they are collateralizing the data, the information, thus allowing them to scale the depth of their business engagement and the risk they're taking with those miners. Suddenly, that information has commercial value for those artisanal small-scale miners. It's the same for TMB in DRC. The due diligence they are doing is through the accumulation of information through how they do due diligence. So I think we just need to shift our lens on how we look at it.
Okay, well, we have to end. I'm getting eyes from our leader over here. So we'll end it there. Thank you so much, panelists. Thank you guys for your questions. Really appreciate it.